Hello everyone, welcome to the second session of this webinar entitled Digital Humanities, New Approach to Research and Teaching of the Medieval Mediterranean. I would like to say thanks again to the Society of the Medieval Mediterranean for sponsoring this webinar. In this session, focused on digital teaching, we have the privilege to count with the presence of panelists who are experts, who are specialized in this field, okay? Just like previous session, I will introduce them in order of appearance. So, and then we have, then we will speak, and then we have enough time for question, okay, for attendees to make questions to the speakers. So, our first panelist is Jamie Good. Okay. Okay. Jamie, that we have now in a video, okay? Hi, Jamie, is Associate Professor of History at the University of Lincoln. He's especially interested in digital pedagogies and to create and share the results of the independent work with others, both within and beyond the academy, okay? So thank you for staying here, Jamie. And the next speaker will be Charles West. I try to put down, yep, Charles, hi Charles. Charles is reader in medieval history at the University of Sheffield. He's focused on the advantages of Wikipedia for teaching at the higher education, specifically in medieval history. So thank you for staying here, Charles. Our next speaker, our third speaker is, okay. Okay, try to, okay. Lynn, hi Lynn. Lynn Raimi is Professor of French at Vanderbilt University and Faculty Director of the Digital Humanities Center. She's working to create a video game engine that will allow, that will allow users to play as medieval travelers, so quite interesting. Our next panelist, thank you Lynn for staying here as well. Our next panelist is Dr. Robert Hutton. I will try to put them into the screen. Okay, now. I think, yeah, Robert, you are, no, we don't have you in this. Okay, Robert. I don't know because Jamie is fixed in the screen, I think. I tried to fix it. A ver, now. I don't know if you, I see Jamie, I don't know if you see Robert in the screen. Could you say me?
Yeah, I can see Robert, yeah.
Okay, okay, thank you. So, as I say, Robert Hutton is interested in video games too. He is a senior lecturer in early medieval history at the University of Winchester. His work considers the representation of the Middle Ages in modern games and the ways in which these games can be used for teaching and research. Okay? And finally, Ainhoa Castro Correa. Ainhoa, we have here. So Ainhoa is lecturer in manuscript studies and history of the church at the University of Salamanca in Spain. She ran the website literavisigotica.com about Iberian peninsular manuscript studies, focuses on Visigothic scripts. So thank you all of you for staying here today. And now we will start. I'm going to make a quick introduction to how this webinar works. I remind you that each speaker will take about 15 minutes and then we'll go on to the Q&A questions, okay, for about 10-15 minutes. So I would like to encourage attendees, all of you attendees that you are here, we know, to write their comments or questions in the Q&A portal that you have at the bottom of the screen, okay? So are you ready? Let's start, okay? So, we will begin with our first panelist, that is Jamie. I'm going to try to, okay, thank you for disconnect the video. Okay, thank you, Lynn. Okay, so Jamie will give a paper about making digital history. So I hand over to you, Jamie, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everyone can see me, and
yeah.
I'm going to try and share my screen in right now.
We
Can you
see
see my screen?
Yeah, yeah.
Excellent. I will start the slideshow. Okay, as Nurea said, I'm associate professor in history at the University of Lincoln. I'm a medieval historian, and I work particularly on the late antique and early medieval period in the Iberian Peninsula. But for the past few years, I've been involved in various digital history teaching projects at the University of Lincoln and collaborating with people elsewhere. So I'm going to sort of talk to you a little bit about some of those, and then the main part of the talk will be about one particular project I've been doing over the last couple of years. There's no pretense here to being systematic. This diagram doesn't represent any kind of theory of teaching and learning. It simply represents what I've worked on, really. And I was trying to, for an introduction, I wanted to kind of try and summarize some of the, kind of try and tie that together, and really what my approach to digital history teaching, particularly in teaching medieval things, because that's my specialism, has been to focus on active engagement, active student engagement, not passive engagement. So there are a number of different ways in which I've tried to work with this over the years, to encourage students to learn about navigating the internet for themselves rather than telling them not to do it, which was the approach when I first started teaching. Warning people off Wikipedia hasn't worked. Engaging students actively and creatively with Wikipedia, like Charles is going to talk about, I think has a lot more benefits to it. I am particularly interested in approaches that encourage students right from the start of their degrees, and this extends beyond digital approaches, getting students to ask their own questions rather than focusing on answering the questions that we want to ask them. I've also been interested in the different ways in which students learn through play, and that's whether they learn through play within the classroom, through possibly creating kind of games within the classroom, or what they learn through playing computer games. So I'm particularly interested to hear Robert's talk as well. And really through all of this, what I'm very interested in unpicking, and what I think is particularly powerful for students, is this idea of making, that by making things, objects digitally, or making meaning for themselves by doing things actively, this is a really powerful way of activating student learning and engagement and interest in our subject. The project I'm going to talk about now is one that's about reading, and really thinking about how we kind of teach students to read, really, and thinking about how we can encourage them to be more active in their approach to reading online in particular, through actively commenting and through asking questions of their own based on their reading, rather than answering my questions about the reading. I already know what answers I've got to my questions. I don't really need the students to tell me them, if I'm being perfectly frank. So the project that I've been doing for the last couple of years is called we've decided to call it Active Online Reading, and it really stemmed from a problem that I've faced ever since I began teaching at university over 15 years ago now, is how to get students to engage actively with their reading. I used to be perplexed that students would come to class and seem not to have done the reading, or not really to have processed it at all, or to have like a minimal grasp of what they'd read. And when I first started, I used to think it was because they weren't doing the reading. What I, over time, have come to understand is that many students, not all students, but most students do the reading or try to do it. The issue is that there isn't that reading isn't activated. They're not encouraged to process that reading, or at least in the way that I was doing it, they weren't encouraged to process it. So over the last couple of years, over several years, but particularly over the last couple of years, I've been working on a project that's about encouraging students to engage actively with their reading, to think critically and ask questions about reading as they're doing it. And the way I've done this is by using an online tool called Talis Elevate, which I'll show you on the next screen, which is a tool that enables students to individually and collectively, to annotate the readings, and to share them with one another, to share them with me. But the approach that I'm going to talk about does not rely on using Talus Elevate. It simply relies on having a shared online space in which students can comment on reading and share their thoughts with one another. What it's enabled me to do is to gain an insight into how students interact with readings, and for the students it enables them to generate a shared bank of knowledge that they can work on together and come back to when they're doing assignments. So overall, what I've been trying to do over the last few years is promote more active engagement in reading by the students, and that just simply means getting the students to think. It's not about doing anything fancy, creating online objects or anything like that. It's simply getting them to do some very basic level processing while they're engaging. The context in which I've done this, although we've been experimenting with it across my department at Lincoln, is in a third-year module that's my own research-based module, and I've been doing it for the last 2 years. So the first year we had one group of students, about 20, and last year we doubled the numbers, so there were about 40 students. What I require the students to do every week is relatively simple. A key point about it, though, is that it is assessed, so it carries a grade, so that really motivates the students to engage. They're required to post 2 or 3 online comments on the weekly readings that they're doing. That's all they have to do. And what you have here is a screenshot of Talus Elevate that shows you what it looks like when the students are doing their annotations. They highlight text, they add an annotation, they can respond to each other's comments. But it simply looks like a kind of PDF, a PDF viewer in a way. And as I said, it doesn't require the use of this specific tool, Talus Elevate. It could be any kind of forum for sharing readings online. Students can complete this activity. I ask them to do things like point out points of interest, ask questions that this raises for them, and think about things like how the materials relate to one another, how the different weeks relate to one another, how it relates to other modules they've done. So it's just getting them to think about the reading, not asking them specific questions. I use this then to structure the seminars, and as I said, it creates a shared bank of knowledge for the students, which they can come back to later, and that they seem to really appreciate this. We've seen quite high levels of engagement with this activity. So in the first year, over the course of the semester, we had over 500 comments. In the second year, we doubled that. There were double the number of students. You can see from the 2 graphs that the class was on a Thursday because that's when most of the comments happened. The middle graph and the one on the right, what you can see is that the attainment, sort of engagement peaked around assessment time, but that it was fairly high throughout, except right at the very end. I found that most students engaged with this activity. Some students didn't, but many students don't engage with whatever activity you ask them to do. Some of them really got deeply engaged with it and found it very useful. They took a lot of private notes as well, so they were using it as a kind of way of taking notes to support their own individual learning as well as collectively. How do I encourage this engagement? Basically, I frame the whole activity as being relatively low engagement. They need to do a little bit and often. They don't have to do a great deal, but there is a benefit from this engagement. So I kind of make a positive out of an a potentially instrumental approach to their learning. A question I've got asked several times when I've given versions of this talk before is, does this activity or activities like it engage different kinds of students? And I think that what I found is that to some extent, certain students who don't say anything in class really prefer this approach, and the feedback that I've got from students reflects that. So it's quite good for engaging certain groups of students that don't normally engage. But what I've also found is it continues to engage those students who are quite vocal. Usually students who are vocal in class will be vocal in an online space too, so they're willing to still share their thoughts. So it doesn't alienate strong students, what we would traditionally consider to be strong students who contribute a lot in class, but it brings along other groups of students. The final thing that I want to emphasize is that I treat this as entirely as a student space. I don't intervene when they're commenting at all. Obviously, if they posted something inappropriate, I would say something, but they haven't done that so far. So it's not about me going in there and interacting with them. It's not about me going in there and asking questions. It's about the students engaging with the material themselves. Then I can see that and I use that to structure what we do in class. That's where my intervention comes when I'm thinking about what we'll do in class. Here are just a couple of comments from students. One of the benefits that they pick out is that it gives, requiring this low level of active engagement means that every student who's engaged can kind of develop a baseline of knowledge for when they come to class. It enables them to learn from each other and kind of clarify understanding if they need to, if they've not quite understood something. The second quotation, at least the first part of the second quotation, really gets at this idea of a sort of safe space for some students who perhaps feel a little bit more reticent about speaking out in class. And then the second point is really what one of the key things I want them to learn, which is engaging directly with a specific piece of text, which is I've often found quite difficult to get students to understand. That's one of the key points of the craft of doing the topic, is picking out specific pieces of evidence and using that to back up your argument. This is quite a good way of doing that, because highlighting the text and adding a comment requires the students to do that. I think, yeah, I'm at about 11 minutes, so I've got 2 slides left. I think, right, okay, so the first one is, what I did was I kind of did an overview of the types of comments that I saw students making on the readings, and as you saw, I had a very large number of comments to kind of look at. So this is kind of impressionistic. I haven't done the stats, and I think it reflects some of the ways in which students engage with texts if they're not given direction. So this is what happened when I didn't tell the students what to do. What I started to see was quite a lot of students would make comments that were of a sort of commentary nature. They would kind of paraphrase what the text said. Then some students would take that to the next level and do some kind of analysis. They try and say, well, what does this mean? How does this relate to other things we've looked at? They try to kind of take it to a next level. As I said, I was specifically asking the students to pose their own questions. So quite a lot of students posed questions broadening out from the text. One of the things that I did notice was there wasn't a great deal of discussion. There hasn't been a great deal of discussion between the students. What you tend to happen is that students will cluster their comments around a particular area that they seem to be finding of interest, rather than actually discussing it. And I think that's quite interesting. Again, I wasn't directing them to do that, but this was quite, I think it speaks to a certain reticence to engage directly with one another. And then there's a certain level at which students try to create connections between the different sessions on the module. Less common are those sorts of what I think are more interactive, discursive connections between students. I think directly discussing things, answering one another's questions, questioning one another's questions. I haven't seen as much of that, and I think that's probably because of the way I've framed the activity. But I think by looking at these comments, what I start to see is the different ways in which students actually engage with the text, and I think that's useful for thinking as I go forward about how I might start to direct them to develop different skills in the future. Okay, just some reflections and conclusions. First block is really about what I think the benefits are of this active approach to reading. I think by asking students to do a frequent micro-level engagement with the text, just little things, and often it requires them to learn how to process the reading, rather than expecting them to do it just because I've set it. So I think that's vital. That's the active part of this, I think. In terms of sort of selling it to the students, the key thing is really this framing, that I frame this as it's low input, it's low risk. You're sharing small pieces, you're sharing with the others, but it's not sharing everything. It's not the same as being in a seminar, but that there's reward attached to it. So the framing is quite important. And I think that process of kind of actively querying the text is really important for getting the students to understand what it is we do when we're being historians or being medieval historians. And I don't think often a lot of attention is paid to that. We assume that the students can read actively, and this is one approach that I found works quite well for doing that. In terms of making digital history, my overall sort of final points are, I think this approach complements, it doesn't replace traditional methods. I think, in fact, one of the strengths of it is that it's developing disciplinary skills at the same time as showing students how to use different types of tools. So it complements what we do already, but it develops different skills and capabilities for the students. And it encourages them to be active. It encourages them to be purposive. It encourages them to decide what they're going to do and actually do it, rather than being told what to do. And I think there's a great benefit from the kind of collective aspect here too. By getting the students to work together, they're able to achieve a lot more than if they work independently. And that's one of the ways in which I try and sell the idea of sharing your thoughts to the students. So they're just a few insights from my experience. The final thing is that I have to leave soon to go and put my daughter to bed, my little daughter. So I'm not going to be around for questions, but if anyone does have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them via email, or for you to pass them to Nerea, and I will answer them afterwards. If there are any in the chat now, I'll have a quick look and try and answer them too. Okay, so thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Indeed, there are one question for you, so if you want to ask now, and then we will pass to another speaker, okay?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
Sí, it's a question from David Natal, who are wondering, how do you mark the Thales Elevate activity? How do you differentiate between 2-to-1 and 2-to-2, for instance? Also, 15% would be double marked as RHUL. I assume that is not the case at Lincoln.
So what we have a specific rubric for students' participation in class. We've always had that. And what I've used this as an opportunity to do, well, what colleagues have used this as an opportunity to do alongside me, is to develop a rubric that allows us to assess the students' engagement in work outside of the class. So this means we've got a model now for assessing what the work that students are doing online, which is going to prove really useful over the next few months, possibly years. So for the kind of participation element, some of it is simply for doing the task. The students will receive a grade, but there's also a kind of element of the grade that is for the kind of level of intellectual engagement with the activity. And we've kind of tried to like to think about what would be a 2-1 piece of work in the UK means something that's graded between 60 and 70%. A first class grade is above 70%. So we've tried to kind of balance that by using this participation rubric that now has an online element. If anyone would like to have access to that, I'm more than happy to share that with them. Does that answer the question? I think
that yes. Okay, because we have in the QA, yeah. Okay, the rest of questions for Jamie must be by email. I send you later your email, okay? Because if not, we don't have enough time for continue with this webinar. So excellent. Dominic, I give you the email of Jamie, okay? Later, okay?
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Jamie.
Bye-bye.
First here, bye. Okay, now we go with our second speaker, Charles, who will talk about Wikipedia and the 21st century Middle Age. Now, Charles, it's your turn. Thank you for staying here. So whenever you want.
Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you can all hear me all right. It's great to be joining you, and I'm honoured to be in such illustrious company. I often start talks like this one with what sounds like a mini advertisement for Wikipedia. It gets billions of views every month from across the world. It's the most comprehensive encyclopedia ever to have existed, even bigger than Venus Steinover's Isidore of Seville's etymologies. It's the world's main source of historical knowledge, reaching people without access to libraries and making knowledge accessible to anybody without an with only an internet connection. And this is, I think, very appealing these days, in these days of paywalls and high subscriptions and things like that. Worth pointing out, by the way, that Wikipedia's traffic went up very considerably during lockdown because everywhere else is closed. So where are you going to find things out from? I'd also point out it's durable. It's a digital humanities project which is now over 20 years old and still going strong. It's open for everybody to edit and improve, so it's democratic. And it's transparent. I'm sure you all know this already, but every Wikipedia page has a history of its own, which anyone can check. So you can find out for yourself who added which bit to which page when. Wikipedia these days is a slight exaggeration perhaps, but it's as close to the truth as the internet gets, right? And I think that makes it pretty important. I'm not actually as much of a techno-optimist, however, as that spiel might make me sound. Wikipedia does have problems too. In its demographics, most of its editors are white middle-aged men, and with its growing internal complexity, you can practically watch as it becomes increasingly complicated for novices to navigate when they make their edits, and that's got big implications for what's featured. And though Wikipedia itself is a not-for-profit company, it nevertheless underpins in important ways the very much for-profit strategies of huge companies like Amazon and Google, both of whom regularly make substantial donations to Wikipedia and use its data in their algorithms precisely because it's neutral and trustworthy. So when you edit Wikipedia, you're adding value to Google, you're making Jeff Bezos a little bit richer, you are feeding the Silicon Valley Leviathan. However, we have to deal with the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And the point remains that Wikipedia is now the main way in which the world finds out about the past, and the main way in which the ideas and statements about history get fact-checked. And that seems unlikely to change anytime soon. So getting your students to contribute to Wikipedia is a way of teaching them about public history. It's a way of giving them some practical digital humanities experience. And it's a way of improving the world's access to history in general and medieval history in particular. So making sure that the Middle Ages has the profile on the internet that we all know it deserves. Okay, this might sound, I hope it sounds all very well in principle. How does it sound how does it work in practice? So I've been getting students here in Sheffield to edit Wikipedia for a few years now. Mostly at MA level, though this year I'm planning to have a go with some final year undergraduates as well, inspired by colleagues who've done this with great results. I give the students a few pointers, and then they take some free online training provided by the brilliant Wikimedia, which is a charity which supports Wikipedia, and that just gives them the basics. You can find my old module guide online if you just search for teaching with Wikipedia, and my name it's on Google, so you can have a look exactly how I do it. Now, together, my students and I over the last few years have edited about 30 Wikipedia pages. That doesn't sound that many, and in a way it's not that many, but together we have nevertheless improved the site's coverage of the Middle Ages, and let me give you a couple of examples. One student created a new page on the Carolingian pilgrim Bernard. He's a monk who made a journey to Jerusalem in the 860s. Bernard's an interesting figure. He's not hugely famous, and his Wikipedia page now gets about 1 or 2 views a day. In Wikipedia terms, that's peanuts, right? I mean, that's super niche, but it adds up. So over the past few years, this student's work has now been viewed and read more than 1,000 times. That's rather more than can be said for most assignments and essays. And as an added benefit, it's also created a useful resource for students on other modules which I teach. And interesting, actually, since it was created, the page has been further edited by 6 other anonymous Wikipedians. So it's really become a kind of collaborative project. Most students on this Wikipedia model I've been teaching actually, though, edit already existing pages rather than starting new ones. And here, the impact is a bit harder to kind of quantify or to measure. But let me give you another example here of the Anglo-Saxon Council of Hartford, which is fairly obscure. Well, anyway. Now, since 1963, it's been agreed by specialists that this council took place in the year 672. But until 2018, Wikipedia relied on pre-1963 scholarship and put the date at 673. So the student added in the correct date to the page and added also a section on why the dating's been changed. And actually, interestingly, in discussion with me, the student pointed out that before her edits, a surprising number of recently published books and articles had strangely used the antiquated 673 date for the Council of Hartford. Who knows where those scholars got their information from? Now, again, the Council of Hertford isn't a particularly high-profile page, but it gets about 4 visits a day, and that's a lot again relative to most assignments. No PowerPoint from me, it's just me chatting, and those 4 visitors a day who are now looking at this page are now getting more accurate information than they would otherwise. I don't want to make this seem too rosy, this experiment, because there have been some bumps in the road. Hang on a second. So 1 year a student had all her edits overturned, okay, by a zealous editor. Another year, another student had a lengthy battle with an editor, which resulted in an unsatisfactory compromise. Some changes have seemed to me potentially to make Wikipedia pages more detailed, but also more confusing. I mean, writing a clear encyclopedia entry is hard, and Wikipedia entry pages often become sprawling messes. But because I assessed the course through a reflexive essay and not on the edits themselves, these problems just become more ingredients for students to reflect on. Okay, with all this in mind, I think there's lots to encourage you to get your students editing Wikipedia. Pedagogically, it ticks all kinds of boxes, some of which Jamie's just been talking about. It frames students as active producers, not passive consumers. It provides them with genuine experience of real-world collaboration. It gives them practice in writing in a non-academic register. It enables them to put their expertise to practical use, and it shows them the value of that expertise beyond the ivory tower. And as students on the class tell me, they love the way in which this course enables them to make some kind of tangible difference in the world, which is not something you can usually say about medieval history options, immensely valuable though we know they are. And here's my tip. If you can assess students on their reflections and not just on their edits, well, that provides a safety net in case things go wrong, but also it develops students' awareness of an important dimension of 21st century knowledge production and dissemination, and of how historical knowledge changes over time. I mean, that's something all students know, history students know, right, in theory, but it's different when they watch it happen and contribute to it happening. Seeing how Wikipedia pages morph from a base provided by the 1902 Encyclopedia Britannica or the 1913 Catholic Encyclopedia, which together provide the substrate for most articles on medieval European history, it's really instructive. By the way, someone at some point should really do a study on how those 2 early 20th century encyclopedias have shaped the way medieval history is presented. So these are all really positive reasons, I think, to introduce Wikipedia editing into your teaching as a way of equipping your students with valuable skills and of incrementally improving the encyclopedia. But I want to end on a more somber note. As we've learned in recent years, medieval history is often appropriated by malevolent political forces. And let me give you a rather troubling example of that. While academics were writing their articles and their books for a small and specialist audience, a number of mostly anonymous Wikipedia editors slowly but surely slanted the Wikipedia page on the Frankish ruler Charles Martel to present his life as leading up to the Battle of Poitiers or the Battle of Tours, as part really of a wider framing of medieval history as a clash between Christianity and Islam. And the Wikipedia page on Martel came gradually to reflect, at least in part, the ideology of the Christchurch murderer who wrote Martel's name on the barrel of a gun when he shot 51 innocent people in New Zealand. Over a weekend in March 2019, I borrowed Paul Foraker's book on Merovingian Francia, and I re-edited the Martel Wikipedia page, not to cut the Battle of Poitiers out altogether, but to set the battle in a wider context as part of Martel's activities, not their culmination. I'm not a Merovingian specialist, but I was reasonably satisfied that the end result fairly represented up-to-date views on Martel. But of course, it wasn't the end result, because since then, since March 2019, what is basically alt-right ideology has been coming back to the Martel Wikipedia page bit by drip, drip by drip. I don't think these edits are part of an orchestrated campaign, but then again, they might be. And I think this is quite a serious issue. The page of Martel currently states, and this is a quote, "Most notably, Martel decisively defeated a Muslim invasion of Aquitaine at the Battle of Tours. This victory is seen as a crucial historic act of preservation of Western culture." Over 1,000 people a day are now reading this Wikipedia page on Martel, the Battle of Poitiers, which presents views that no serious specialist would countenance today. Now, this isn't a criticism of Wikipedia. It's not Wikipedia's fault that this is a bad page. Anyone can edit it. But there are only so many hours in the day, right? And as individuals, we can't spend all our time in Wikipedia edit walls when we have online teaching to prepare for. So that's why I think ultimately the most important outcome of my MA teaching on Wikipedia isn't the 30 or so pages that have been edited to date, but the 30 or so critically aware, critically educated history students who've now been trained in how to edit Wikipedia pages, and who might at some point down the line make more contributions themselves to the Sisyphean task of keeping Wikipedia as the main source of global historical knowledge up to date, on track and up to speed, right? Or at least they might at least understand from their own experience how claims to truth are staked and negotiated on the platform. And in some ways, this really isn't about making the world a better place. It's just about stopping it from becoming a worse one. And that, like most things, is best done collaboratively. Thank you very much.
Which is fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much for this amazing paper. Now, I encourage all the attendees to type your question in the Q&A portal. And at the end of the webinar, Charles could answer you to all your questions. I think that you have a lot of questions because it's a very interesting topic, as well as Amy topic, okay? So now we have our third panelist. Yeah, I have the microphone. That is Lynn, who talk about digital resource for teaching the medieval Mediterranean. So Lynn, when you want. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Charles. That was really interesting, and it actually comes in nicely with this discussion of various resources. One of my projects is to work on the Global Middle Ages project, which tries to bring in different views of the Middle Ages from around the world. And the main goal for that is actually to get a better understanding of what it was, what the Middle Ages was, and what it meant to the world and not just to the West. And so for this talk, I'm really focusing on the Mediterranean, but I want to get the point across that through digital and online resources, we can really teach a lot more of the global Middle Ages in a variety of classroom settings and different disciplines than we ever could before. So this is a pretty basic talk on where to find things. So for primary sources, primary data and sources, now it's really just a question of finding the computing power and the time to process the information rather than waiting for interlibrary loans or acquiring funds to visit archives or doing any of those things. It's really open to the public in ways that it never has been before. So digital maps, 3D models, video, audio, online archives, and these are just some of the resources that we can give our students to give them this really, I guess, nuanced picture of the world from 500 to about 1500. So I'm going to go through a series of those and talk about just some examples of experiencing the past through these visualizations and immersive environments, which can be 3D, it can be virtual, it can be augmented reality, and to kind of, how can we help our students, how can we help ourselves really come closer to seeing and experiencing the past as it might have been experienced and seen by those who lived it. There are, as always with all of these technologies, negatives, and one of the things is accessing these resources. Sometimes they are a little hard to find, and there's not good ways to locate the ones that you want for your class. So I am going to talk a little bit about where to look, because as we know, you can look on Google and Google Scholar and find a ton of print resources. It's harder to find platforms, and it's harder to find articles that really talk about aggregating digital medieval resources. And let's try to look at those and see if we can find some that we can use in the classroom. So while you might encounter broken links or outdated materials, these aggregation platforms and articles, if you can go to those, let me actually show you. It's this one. Every time I touch, sorry, every time I touch my mouse, it goes to the next one. Yeah, so you can find, through these aggregated resources, you can find some of these scholars that are working on things. So I would just suggest if you go to one of these sites and you find that the links are broken or whatever, just go ahead and contact the people who put it up and see what they've been working on lately. Because it is true that these digital projects go out of style. They no longer work on the platforms that they were developed for very quickly, but that doesn't mean that the people who developed them aren't still working in that area. And in the archival resources that I'm talking about, you can still access, for the most part, the data, and that's pretty key for sustainability. Now, if you're trying to find, if you're teaching the medieval Mediterranean and you're trying to locate sources about non-Western cultures, that's a lot harder, I would say. We would like to, at least at the Global Middle Ages platform, we really look for things authored by scholars from a diverse set of backgrounds. So I can give an example, and that's the Medieval Academy of America's curated medieval digital resources. It's a good resource, and it provides short descriptions and links to these databases and digital projects, but there aren't very many non-Western resources at all. So that's what the Global Middle Ages platform really focuses on. So I would suggest that you maybe start at the Global Middle Ages platform. So I put that at the bottom of the screen here, talking about these different portals. I do think the Medieval Academy of America is a good one, but look for ones that maybe bring in different points of view than what your students may be used to getting. Okay, so one of the resources that we like to suggest are virtual and augmented reality, just for the sense that students, first of all, enjoy it, and they also get that sense of being there. These have become really inexpensive to use in the classroom, both in terms of technology and in terms of content. So some of it, at the very lowest entry point, you can use on a smartphone and a cardboard app. You can buy the little viewers, a holder for your phone, which only costs about $8. So even most classrooms can afford to get that. And that's either at with children, so K-12 in the US, or at the university level can work with this. And you can get much better viewers with access to much more complex applications, and they're still not that expensive. So it's $200 for an Oculus Go. You can spend on up to $1,600 for the HTC Vive or others, but you really don't need that in the classroom. Then you just go through the online stores for these devices and buy these applications and use them with your students. Steam, the gaming platform Steam, if you're familiar with that, you can find AR and VR content there as well. It's a little bit harder sometimes to find, for instance, the museum pieces. And that's what I would suggest, is that museum pieces museums are a great source for this educational AR and VR content. Some museums, however, really want you to be on site to do this. But there are others, like this one on the screen now, the Live the Past from the National Archaeological Museum in Spain. I've played with it on the go, and it's a lot of fun, and it's well done. So if you can get your students, I put my students in that little environment, and they kind of got the sense of what it was like in medieval Muslim Spain. And it's available for Oculus Rift, Quest, Go, or Gear VR. Or you can do it in Spanish or English. A guide shows them kind of the village square back as it was, the exterior of the mosque, and then inside a home. And I just think it brings to life for the students what was not really, I guess, it seems so far away to students sometimes that doing this is a different thing for them. You can also freely explore the area. And the same is true for Hyver Labs, Churches of Famagusta. And I think that's on my next one. Yeah, this is based on art historian Michael Walsh's work. It's really well documented. So this is like a little, I guess, a research piece in and of itself. So you can have students talk about these resources and photographs of these churches that, he explains how they use texture maps to place over the digital frameworks for these buildings. So you could either have the students talk about the process of creating these sorts of things, or you could have them talk about the objects themselves or the churches themselves, and just whatever interests them. I think you can go there. With virtual Placencia, and I had that before, I'm going to go back to that. I'm not sure why I had that out of order, but that's on the bottom right there, that virtual Placencia. You can find that at theglobalmiddleages.org, and it's Roger Martinez Davila's work on Placencia. And it's really interesting to play through this. It's kind of gamified too, which makes it fun. But also he's got a crowdsourced site for working on manuscripts and all sorts of things that your students may find really interesting. Next, I want to talk a little bit about 3D maps. Let's see, and online and interactive mapping, which is another thing that I think a resource that students enjoy and that you can get a lot out of too as a teacher. So what we try to do is use these online maps to have students orient themselves spatially in the areas that they're being studied. So this helps them learn better, but it also just gives them a sense of where are we talking about, what are we talking about during what times. So one site I like to use is the map hosted at the University of California, Davis, which allows students to explore the map based on topics like trade routes or religions or wind and ocean currents. So it just depends on what their interests are. It's very flexible for that. Mapping Mandeville, I think I've got, so that's the UC Davis site, sorry that I put the link for there, but also here are a few more sites. Mapping Mandeville lets users see the world as viewed through the eyes of the 14th century John of Mandeville, who supposedly travels from England to the east, and it maps these onto a reproduction of the Hereford map. Students enjoy that. They enjoy looking at the old maps, and they also try to link it up with the modern day. As a classroom project, one thing I've had students do is to, be inspired by these scholarly maps and then make their own maps of the works that they're studying just using Google Maps, which is a very simple thing. You go, for instructions, you can just look into My Google Maps. So just Google My Google Maps and you'll find out how to add your own maps and have students work in groups to add data. You can add pictures, you can add all sorts of resources to share. Okay, databases and archives. Where can you find these things? That they're harder to find than you might think, but again, look in the aggregated resources portals if you can. But I just wanted to talk about one, Syriaca.org, which I find really, I guess, a good example of all the, it's a multinational group of people working on resources that come from all over the world. And that's what I find inspiring about this. You could set the students to looking at, for instance, the catalogs of saints, the handbooks of the authors writing in Syriac, the database of hagiographical literature, and they could do a project, for instance, locating translations of the stories of John the Baptist, or comparing differences in all the different tales of John the Baptist, and talking about time and place and composition, what was going on at the time that these things were written. So this could really be something fun for younger students, but it could go all the way up to the PhD level where people could use this as a resource for their work. Otherwise, I think, cultural resources we like to kind of think about. I think I'm going to get... that's actually my thing. It's a soundscape of a medieval city in the Abbasid Caliphate. So I don't know if you can hear it, but if you go to this, it's oddly, I guess, appealing to people to put together the soundscape, and you can, in the different channels that are there, you can pick what you want to have as the sound. So I like to use that a lot with my students. They really do enjoy kind of like what's the sound of animals, the marketplace, being called to prayer, what was it like to be there? And it kind of piques a different sense for students. So these digital resources, I think they just kind of bring the past and the present of these faraway lands to our doorsteps. I like to think that they allow students to experience the past and other cultures in ways that are more diverse and bring them to a different understanding, really, of what's going on in the history of other parts of the world. So fortunately, you don't have to create these. You can have students create them, but you can also simply guide students in the directions of these online resources and let them discover and bring to the classroom what they find interesting. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aline. I can't wait to share all of these databases and resources for my students because we began the course these days. So thank you very much. I learned a lot. Now, okay, I encourage everyone again to write all your questions that you have for Lynn or for Charles in the QA portal. You could write it now, and then at the end of the webinar, both could ask your questions, okay? So now, yes, I have, yes, okay. So now we have our next panelist, who is Robert Hutton, who talked about the Investiture Contest, a game for teaching and research. So Robert, okay, you are in. You have to, okay, thank you. You are.
Brilliant. No, thank you very much, Neria, and well, thanks very much for having me, and thanks to all of the speakers. This has been fascinating. So much so, well, I should open by saying that my project is much more embryonic. It's much less fully formed than the three that we've heard about to this point. Let's see if I can get the screen shared there. Is that working for everybody?
Yeah.
Brilliant, marvelous. So, what I'm talking about today is a game that I've been producing, a game that I've been using for teaching for the last year or so now. I've started life as a board game. I'm moving it into a digital format currently. So as I say, very embryonic, especially with the digital aspect of it. I've included my details here. If you want a copy of the board game, then please drop me an email. The rules are ridiculously simple, but I'll get on to explaining that in a moment. So, what I'm going to do today then is talk about three things very briefly and swiftly. So first of all, I want to talk a bit about how games can be used for teaching and indeed for historical research. Then I want to go on and talk a bit about the board game that I produced to look at the Investiture Contest and how I've used that for teaching in this past year. And finally, I'm going to go on and talk about how I'm planning to use this game in this academic year, and what are my plans for developing computer games for teaching in the future. So to start with, there are plenty of examples of games being used for teaching within the pre-university classroom especially, but increasingly within the university classroom. We're also starting to see a few examples of games being used for research purposes. Very broadly speaking, there are three primary ways in which we can use games to engage with history. We can use games, three ways in which games represent history. So first of all, games can represent history. They can represent the past through their use of data, through their use of landscapes, as in the top left image here, of how they reconstruct built landscapes, how they reconstruct material cultures, and how they use historical figures. So many of the things that Lynn was talking about in her paper. This can be an incredibly useful way in which we can get students interested in a period of history. It's where we can introduce them to some of the key themes of that period, some of the key ideas about the past. And that's great. But I think there's some more interesting ways in which games can be used to approach history. And games can represent historical arguments. And in fact, I would make the case that any historical game makes some kind of historical argument. And they do this primarily through their rules, through the game mechanics. So for example, if you've got a game that's primarily about trade, the example I've got here is one of the patrician series, where you travel around the Baltic Sea, buying and selling goods, and essentially becoming a more wealthy and powerful merchant. So games which use economic structures like this, they're representing a model of these structures, and these structures are built on historical theory. They're built on a particular argument about how these structures functioned, how limited aspect of the medieval world, in this case, functioned, how it worked. And what I think is particularly interesting is that the players of these games are able to interrogate these arguments through play. By engaging with the game, they're required to engage with the game's mechanics, and in turn, they engage with the arguments which these mechanics represent. And by playing the game, perhaps most obviously, they can interrogate these arguments by looking for deviations for the historical norm. So the bottom left-hand corner here, we can see that, or Charlemagne, or perhaps Lothair II, has conquered the entirety of Europe. If this is something that happens routinely through gameplay, this suggests that the argument that the game's mechanics do not perhaps fit the reality as well as they could. It suggests that they need to become more nuanced to be a better fit for historical theory. And ultimately, it's possible to engage with history through games as a form of historical debate. And this can be done by modifying games. By changing the rules of the game, the players change the argument that it's making. And by having a bit of back and forth here, by providing mods and counter mods, we can see more nuanced, more developed arguments emerging through play. So this is all really interesting. This is something that I've seen done a few times and in a few ways with computer games. But there are several key issues when using computer games for these educational purposes. And there are various issues, but most importantly for me are the three issues of transparency, cost, and skill set. So computer games, first of all, they're woefully opaque. They hide the vast majority of their mechanics from the players. Indeed, they have to do this because otherwise the game can become impossible to play. If you're met with just a wall of data when you're trying to run your empire, then things are much less interesting. It can be completely impossible to play these games. Another issue is the sheer cost of computer games, especially more complex games, and also the fact that the skill set required to produce computer games is very often very far removed from the skills held by most historians. And at the start of this project, about a year ago, I came up with a temporary solution, I thought, for all three of these issues. And that's to move over to using physical games for educational purposes. This very neatly gets around the issue of transparency. The players are the ones parsing rules. They're the ones who have to understand how all the mechanics function. You can't hide the rules from the player in the same way that you're obliged to when you're creating a computer game. At the same time, these games are cheaper to produce and easier to modify. It's generally much easier to get your head around the rule set of a typical board game than it is for a computer game. There's also severe limitations placed on how complex board games can be, which in this case is an advantage. I used all of this to produce a board game titled the Investiture Contest, which surprisingly enough was about the Investiture Contest. So this is a conflict notionally between the Pope and Emperor in the second half of the 11th century going into the early 12th century. And the idea has traditionally been this is a conflict about investiture, so who gets to select bishops, and by extension, who gets to control episcopal lands. In reality, the situation was much more complex, but that tends to get skimmed over in most popular histories, so it's possibly something to have watch out for on Wikipedia. And in creating this game, I created this game for use in a couple of modules. So first of all, an MA course, this is our postgraduate course on church, society and conflict, and a bachelor's undergraduate course on the Middle Ages in computer games. And I used the game within both of these modules in the past year, and with some somewhat differing results because we've got students coming in with very different experiences of the material covered and of how games can address the past. And the game itself is ridiculously simple. It's 2 pages of rules, most of which concern the objectives held by each of the players. So it's a game for up to 6 players. Each player represents one of 6 key figures within the Investiture Contest. So the Pope Gregory, Pope Urban II, the Emperor Henry IV, the Archbishops of Ravenna and Milan, Matilda of Canossa, and Wolf of Bavaria. The object of the game is to exert influence over northern Italy and secure the various objectives held by each player. And these objectives are set up such that players will come into conflict at different points throughout the game. I drew up these rules based on the other branch of my research. So my day job is working on the Investiture Contest, or working on northern Italy more generally between the 11th and the 12th centuries. And what I've been working on recently is looking at the relationship networks within northern Italy during the Investiture Contest, and looking at how the conflict seems to be much more complex. How we don't just have a simple conflict between the Pope and the Emperor, but there are various key figures who are notionally on both sides of the conflict, but who are pursuing their own goals, who have their own objectives, which very often are at odds with those of the Pope or the Emperor. So it's a nice convenient tie-in to my existing research. And this has been relatively effective. So the students play through the game a couple of times. A playthrough typically takes about 30 minutes after you've got the rules down. And this helps to inform their understanding of the Investiture Contest. But what's most interesting for me is that after we've played through the game a couple of times, I'll have the students modify it. I'll have them change the rules, and by extension, change the arguments that the game makes. So something that the master's students came up with, they decided that Henry, the player representing the Emperor, was losing too frequently. It was too hard for the Emperor to make progress. So they gave him various advantages. They changed his objectives to make them more viable for him to achieve, basically making the argument that the Emperor was more powerful, was able to exert more control over this region than the initial rules suggested. And another example of a mod representing debate here was another group changed the way influence could be exerted. So in particular, they brought in mechanics to represent the use of papal legates. So the Pope will be able to exert influence from a greater distance than any other player. So they're sticking with the core of the game here, but they're nuancing the argument that it represents by tweaking the mechanics. So this was really interesting. I had some generally positive, although a little bit varied feedback from students. Generally, the game went down well. It's possibly just because it's the novelty of the thing. It's possibly because one class was dedicated to the use of medieval history in games more generally, so the class has greater appreciation of it. But it was nevertheless really interesting to see how students engaged with the game and how they engaged with the Investiture Contest in very different ways from how they normally would do in a typical class. There were, however, a couple of problems with this approach. So the first one of these was the resources available to run the game. So the way I'd set this up, it required a large number of coloured counters and a handful of pawns, which is fine. That was easy to get hold of. I believe the entire thing cost me about £5. That's fine. Where it got problematic, though, was when students wanted to start modding the games. So the modifications students wanted to make on the day were very much restricted to the materials I brought with me. So I brought along dice, I brought along decks of cards, but students still wanted to introduce new maps. They wanted to introduce new mechanics that I hadn't foreseen, that I hadn't got the resources for. That's always going to be an issue with physical games. You're restricted by what you've actually got available on the day. The other issue, which is perhaps more specific to the times we're living in, is that using board games relies on the personal presence of the class. This game can't realistically be run remotely, and it can't realistically be run whilst maintaining social distancing. I did toy briefly with trying to print the map out on an A0 piece of paper and having a complex system involving, well, sticks to move pieces around, but that's not practical remotely. And the solution that I'm working on for this, and why this ties into, well, to a session on digital approaches to teaching, is I'm moving over to a digital format. I'm using a piece of software called Tabletop Simulator, which is produced by the worryingly named Berserk Games. And Tabletop Simulator provides a lot of potential for me. It allows the creation, of more or less any imaginable resources, any imaginable boards. And you can just upload images to use as tabletops. You can import all manner of counters to use within your games. And it can represent incredibly complex games. I should note that I was directed to this by Vinicius Carvalho of the University of Sao Paulo, who's been working using Tabletop Simulator on his game, The Triumphs of Turlough, which is a game looking at, well, it's a group of Irish clowns resisting the English. And he's doing this as a way of depicting his historical research. So, this is what I'm in the process of doing for this year. I'm adapting the game, the Investiture Contest game, for computer games through Tabletop Simulator. And the first step is to recreate the game, to recreate the board game as it is, so players can move their counters around, they can move their pawns around, they can place counters as and when they need to, and they're able to interact with the rules. Moving beyond this, I'm looking at the possibility of coding, of the hard coding of rules within the game. So restricting the actions that players take, automating some actions. So this could be particularly useful if you want to use dice, if you want to bring a random element into the game, if you want to make sure that players don't have to get bogged down looking at individual minor rules. If you want them to concentrate on one particular aspect of the rule set, you can automate a lot of the rules. Looking longer term, I'm very interested in the potential of creating more complex games with students. So this wouldn't work in the format that I'm currently using, because we're restricted to one 3-hour class for using these games. This is potentially something that I'd like to do over the course of an entire module. Start off getting some students some basic coding knowledge, and then developing from there, perhaps modifying existing game to save time and to give better, or to give nicer looking results, let's say. So, all I'd say about this approach is that it requires the players have knowledge of the period that you're working on, which is absolutely fine. This is something to be expected when taking any approach to history, but it also requires a degree of ludic literacy from the players. And that's something a bit harder to come by. Just to wrap things up then, the 3 points I'd like to make. So first of all, I think games have a huge potential as research and teaching tools. I think that there are clearly severe difficulties in implementation, but I'm increasingly convinced that many of these difficulties can be overcome either through the use of board games or through the development of coding skills. So I'll put my details back up there. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Robert, for this interesting talk and for sharing your research with us. And now we will pass the word to our last speaker of today, of this webinar as well, that is Ainhoa Castro Correa, that is going to give a paper about the Scribe of Age, playing with 6th to 30th Iberian manuscripts. So Ainhoa, when you want.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if it works. Okay, we share my screen.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, great, thank you. Okay, so first of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the coordination committee for putting this webinar together, and especially to Nerea for inviting me to take part on it. I would rather not carry on by stressing how trying the situation we are all living is, especially in Spain, unfortunately, albeit it is. I will just say that initiatives like this one help us overcome the news a little bit, and for that, thank you. And thanks also to the other speakers and the silent participants. Although many of you expected to see me in the previous session because of my recently awarded ERC project People and Writing, cheers to me, I'm not going to talk about digital research, but digital teaching. The paper I have prepared to share with you today, entitled The Scribe of Ages, Playing with 6th to 13th century Iberian Manuscripts, is a direct product of these uncertain times, although the result of the work I'm going to talk to you about, albeit it seems expressly tailored to our current context in teaching, is not. We, for I'm the voice of a team, have been thinking and working on it for some time now. So years ago, when I began teaching paleography at university, I became aware of the problems the students face when dealing with it. I was trained in an online university where, as students, we had around 6 months to go through a long list of basic bibliographic references, a thick manual, and many exercises. So the in-person classes with all their peculiarities were new to me. On the one hand, students are shown a set of materials written in Latin for the most part of the medieval period, manuscripts they had not seen before, that were barely aware they existed, and in a language they do not master, since it's no longer mandatory in higher education in Spain as it was before. They are fearful, for they immediately feel paleography is going to be harder than expected. On the other hand, they are supposed to manage the art of transcription in a short period of time, something they did not even know it was a thing. And besides, they need to understand manuscripts, scripts, and how they work. From my point of view, being able to read what a manuscript is about through its text and to transcribe it correctly is an important part of understanding and passing a paleography course, but is not and should not be or shown as the main goal of it. We have very few weeks to teach students everything about manuscripts. Here in Salamanca, I have 3 weeks, 6 classes to teach the medieval part, and yes, I managed to do it. So we should focus on history of written culture, on the people who wrote the manuscripts, the people who read them, the manuscripts themselves and their context. If one understands how writing works through the ages, it will be easier to learn how to deal with it and understand the meaning of written sources. If we, as teachers, manage to get students hooked on manuscripts, they will find the time in the future to learn the language and how to read it. We cannot just expect from them to do all in a 3 weeks mandatory class. So I began looking for a way to focus on manuscript culture during my teaching classes without leaving aside the aspects students should master, but I had no time to teach, mainly transcription. And then I turned to the digital world. Many of you might be aware of the online transcription tools available, like TPEN, and of some of the projects that bring together people to join forces on transcribing a corpus, like the General Historia project. Some might even know about software being tested for automatic transcription, like Transcribus. These tools were a start for what I had in mind, but did not fit with the teaching requirements. There are also some online games to help with the tricky parts of our field, although they exclude Iberian manuscript material, do not allow changing the sources used, so no adaptation, and the user needs to know the basics to be able to play them. If I wanted to give online paleographically inspired gaming a try, ask students to complement their training by playing, it needed to be really useful and adapted to our national teaching program. And to do that, we needed to start from scratch. Yes, we needed our own video game, and that is exactly what we did. From my point of view, as I see it now that we are almost ready to release a full functional version of our game, the project had two fundamental and tricky aspects to cover. Tricky aspect one, our idea required a team and an institution crazy enough to want to do and fund this. Luckily, that was not so very difficult as it seemed at first. In the slide, you can read who the members of the team are. My thanks to all of them. I would like to stress the importance of not only having team members from academia able to provide context to the sources selected as base for our game, but of people who know how video games should be made. That's an important thing. And I'm not only referring to the technical part, but to the inherent components of a video game. As I guess will be the case for many of you, I'm not alien to the topic as a player, but had never considered the flow of actions that were taking place in a game, aimed at achieving a specific goal set for the player. For the debate on this will be long. Just to say gamification, put tasks in the form of games online with the sole purpose of teaching the player something is not the same as a video game in which the player does not have the specific purpose of learning, but of achieving a goal. If you want to do something like this, add to the team someone who knows how to do it. It will make your life much easier. Tricky aspect two. One cannot develop a video game without a very clear and specific idea from which to build it. We wanted for the students to have time to let their brain adapt to the different writing systems that were used in the Iberian Peninsula and their historical context and their own pace. Recognize that these were not the same in all areas of the peninsula at the same time, for them to learn how abbreviations work and be able to decipher them, and then to face the transcription with some confidence. We focused first on the manuscript sources we were going to work with. As you can see in the slide, we selected one codex for each century, one which was representative enough that through its incorporation, it was easier for us as teachers to summarize the program we needed to cover. We focused then on how to present the manuscripts and how to play with them. Our game has, as it is now, 8 levels, one for each codex, with 3 exercises or sub-levels to cover in each part by the player. One on the alphabet, another on the abbreviations, and a final one on transcription. We also added secret levels with additional information on written supports and materials. And I think now is that moment when you are no longer listening to me and want to see the game. So let me show you what is it about. One thing, I'm not going to talk to you through the video, for I think it will take me more time to explain what is going on than for you to realize how it works by yourself. So I will be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end. So now the results. Last year I designed a slightly different class for my medieval polygraphy students. In our 6 classes together, we talk and discuss written production, the different scripts, their context, how manuscripts were made, how people live with them, and what writing meant to people. That instead of doing just transcription aloud, that is kind of annoying. While as mandatory assignment, they had to play our game. Being each student's score achieved in it, the qualification they will get together with the final test. Rest to say, they were thrilled. They began playing while in between classes. They challenged they challenged each other. They passed it to the roommates, and soon we had students from physics to classics playing. We were very careful with the contents of the video game, and to my standards, anyone who manages to finish it has accomplished a fairly good level at polygraphy. Each stage, I don't know if you saw it, but each one is a different type of script, a different manuscript, a different context, so it's quite full of information. Some students finished the game in a couple of days, and some got a higher score than mine, so that's something I need to think about. Our game fits within the gamification type as it is now, and we are aware of that, but it will soon be a proper video game with all its requirements checked. So it will be like a civilization or something like that. It will be really cool. We are working in the history behind the game, and our robot that you saw before, that's the avatar of the player. And the story is that he was a scribe that went to the future and then went back to the Middle Ages to search for clues for finding a saint or something like that. So our robot, this robot, will be faced with the challenge of collecting clues in the form of items that will help him or her, so the student or the player, in solving the final problem and finishing the game. There will be a villain that will annoy our character through the game with new tasks on manuscript that different. And here in the slide, you can see him. So this is our own version of Titibilus, the demon set to work on behalf of Lucifer to induce the scribes to misspellings. That's a very hard rock version of it. There will be more steps of the game available to the player with more manuscripts and context. We will change how scores work and allow the player to use his or her points to improve their robot. And there's a student I had last year who wanted to buy a kitten for the robot. So that's, anyway. We will have an intranet to allow teachers to supervise how students are doing, not just scoring, and many more things. And finally, our video game is free and will always be free for everyone to use, and is easily adapted to other countries' specifics, to other manuscripts, scripts, and languages. We hope it will be made open by the end of the year, and we'd love to see it being used everywhere. It has shown itself to be a great resource for teaching, especially when you do not have as much time as needed, and students really like the experience. So that's all, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Ainhoa, for sharing with us this interesting video game that you have designed. And now is the time for questions. So please, all the people that have any question to make to all the panelists, will do it now. We have some, you can do it in the Q&A portal. So it's your moment to question everything that you want, okay? Not everything of the file, of course. So we have some questions coming. For example, we have a question for Robert from Dominique Wabenhoven that says, thanks a lot for this inspiring presentation. Are you planning to make the digital version of your game publicly available at some point?
Yeah, no, thanks, Dominic. Yeah, absolutely. My understanding of it is I'll be able to just release it for free across the tabletop simulator homepage. So it's irksome because it's out of my control, but yes, it will absolutely be released. Thank you.
Okay, more or less, thank you, Robert. It's another question for you that is more or less the same. Say that, do you plan to launch the game online? Where would this be? A gaming website, your institution site, or in other words, what is, in your opinion, a good game publication strategy? This is a question from Susana Cernakova.
Okay. I'll be honest with you, I have no idea how to go about publishing this effectively. The plan, well, certainly with the digital game, be accessible through Tabletop Simulator. I've got no intentions whatsoever for charging at all for that. The tabletop version, the physical version, all the rules, the map, the various other bits and pieces should be getting made available through the University of Winchester portal. I've forgotten what it's called now. But yeah, they should be available shortly. If you want them, then drop me an email and I'll send them over. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Whereas attendees are thinking about their questions, I would like to say some comment to Charles. Charles, I was amazingly surprised by your speech, because, as you know, a lot of research and academics say that Wikipedia is not useful for teaching and for researching, but I always use it. I mean, I think that it's very useful to use it, because at the end it's very global and you have a lot of information available that you don't have in another way, no? And I would like to ask you, that you know a lot of Wikipedia, what percentage do you think that are incorrect information in Wikipedia? Do you know that is, I mean, I think that people who work who update content to Wikipedia normally are people to really have a base for do that, no? That you do have a lot of experience in that. Do you could say something about that? What is the percentage of people who do you think that make things wrong in Wikipedia, for all people are afraid for using it? I don't know if I explain myself properly.
Yeah, I think so. And thank you for admitting that you use Wikipedia. This is kind of confession time here. But I think, I mean, in practice, I think most people do, right? I mean, just to check things, or to, you know, remind yourself of things you already know, just like you would use an encyclopedia, right? I mean, it is, at its core, it's just an encyclopedia. And just as you might look at an encyclopedia to look something up, that's great. I mean, I think in some ways the problem with Wikipedia in terms of accuracy is exactly the problem with these encyclopedias, in that most often the problem is just that it's very out of date, right? Because, as I mentioned briefly, the main source of most Wikipedia articles of the Middle Ages is old, out of copyright encyclopedias, right? So people have been copying out Britannica, especially from 1902 or whatever, and putting that up. And those have been kind of, you know, people have added bits and bobs, but the kind of structure for most articles is actually, is an early 20th century view of them. So, I mean, is that wrong? I mean, it's not factually, usually it's not factually wrong, but it is interpretively out of date, is what I'd say.
Okay, thank you, Charles, for answering my question. And whereas people attendees, please ask any question that you have now, because we have 10 minutes for ending the session, so it's your moment. And whereas I have the option to ask myself, so I have a question as well for Lynn. Lynn, I think that what you are sharing with us is very interesting, because one problem that I have when I try to teach content to my students is that a lot of resources have copyright, and I can't be able to use them in a legal way. So what do you think that institutions could do, or that we as teachers of a higher level could do, to try to express or to combine another colleagues to the importance of open the resource that we have, to make it in open access?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess for most of the digital resources that I was looking at anyway, they are available. And I think in terms of trying to convince our own colleagues to make their things more available, it just seems obvious to me that you would want more people to, you know, do you really want 5 people to read your article, you know, which is basically the reality of the situation, or would you like for it to be available to a lot of different people? So most of these databases, I know there are some granting agencies that require you to make it open source if open source and open access to the data if you use that grant. So that's a good approach, but I just think more probably awareness and more encouragement from colleagues will be very helpful. When it comes to using things in class that are under copyright, I try to buy a couple of copies. Let's say it's a video game, which I like to use in class. I think they're great. And if you, yeah, I've used, for instance, Assassin's Creed. So you buy that, you want the students to play it or play little parts of it. And, you know, I just get maybe 5 copies and put it on the lab computers and have students use it there. Or I've also had a situation where, and I know you're not supposed to do this, but you have a Steam account and you just give, you know, say it's an account for your class, and you maybe have 5 of them, and you tell the students, okay, yeah, you can only play 1 person at a time, but this group of students, you know, you all use the same account. So that's kind of how I handle it. And it seems to work pretty well. I'm sure there's people who would object, but that's what I do.
Thank you very much for sharing your method. It's very important for, I think, that all the early scholars or postgraduate research that like me that are learning of you, you know, so thank you very much for sharing this. And I want to say that if between us, so between speakers, have any question to other speakers, you could ask then, okay? So I think that we don't have more questions in the Q&A portal. So I know I have a question for you, okay? And please, people, if okay, we have a question in the Q&A. We have a question in the Q&A. Okay, thanks, people. Okay, so we have a question for Ainhoa. Is from Paula that said, I would like to play the game, but can you tell me where I can find the useful materials?
Yes, so you can send me an email. You can send me an email and I will give you access. So now the app is online, so anyone can play. And in fact, the University of Bristol is going to use it this term. So I think it's going to be massive because it will be the music students that are going to test it. But anyway, so it's usable for everyone. If you want to try it, just let me know and I will give you the pass that you will need to get access to it. But the other way, you can just play. So it's available. Send me an email and I will send it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Ainhoa. Are there more questions? If not, we are going to end this webinar. Okay.
I've got a quick question.
Okay.
Actually, to Ainhoa again, I noticed that you gathered data on the gender aspects of your game and like and how men and women reacted to it differently.
Yes.
Why did you do that, and did it surprise you what you found?
Well, it was surprising, I think, to me because well, I cannot see it now, but I think that for male students the playability of the game was boring, so they thought it was too easy. Whereas for female students, they thought it was not easy, and not hard, but just enough. Slightly hard for them to realize how to play it. And if you look at the results for the aesthetics part, the female students like it more than the male students. So, you know, it's just, I think I did it just for fun. I wasn't expecting to get some significant results. But I think, you know, when you design a video game, you need to know the audience for which you are designing it. So for us, I think it's important to be aware of what our students will be looking for. So I may need to do a slightly harder version for more advanced students and a slightly prettier one for other ones. So they get engaged and they don't lose that enthusiasm for playing the game.
Thank you, Anna.
Can I just ask a quick one for the same question, I guess, similar question to Robert. Do you find that there's a kind of a breakdown in the students' I guess engagement with the game?
Yeah, so but on gender basis, you mean? Sorry, yeah. Yeah, it's strangely not. So with the Middle Ages and computer games class, the student body skews very heavily male. So typically we're talking about 90% of the class is male, when typically with most of my modules is 60% female. And yeah, I'm doing various things to try and mitigate that. But generally speaking, though, within the master's module, when the game's just an ancillary part of the course, it's been going down about as well with male and female students. So I think well, building what Anna was saying, it's male and female, well, men and women are almost conditioned to like different things in games, I think. And I think the tabletop game kind of takes off the edge of all the first-person shooter, fast action that men have been told this is what you will play because it's manly. And maybe, I don't know, there's definitely something in there, but I'm very glad that it's nice and flat. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And there are a lot of people that are interested in having your email contact for us. I think that is for ask your question after, so you don't have any problem. I will send it by email. Okay, your email direction. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you to all for staying here. If there is not more question, I think that we are going to the end of this. Sorry. Charles, I have a question for Ainhoa too. Charles, go away. Go.
I've already asked it, Miria. I've asked it already. That was the question I asked.
Okay, yeah. I read the sorry. Okay, so thank you very much to all for staying today here with me. And I'm afraid that it is the end of our time, so we have to close right now this webinar. Okay. Thank you very, very much for coming. It was a great pleasure to have you here. All the panelists for accepting the invitation and for attendees for staying with us. Thanks to all, and of course, thank you to the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean to make this webinar possible and become reality through this prize. And I will remind to you that the recording will be available soon, the recording of this webinar. I contact you by email and I will say where the recording will be available, okay? So you can request it or to recommend to someone or spread it in general. Spread medieval history, please. That is very important, okay? And all the best. I hope to see you soon and that you learn as much as I have learned. Thank you very much for all and bye. Thank you.